Hey everybody, Doug here from 2 Plus Stuff, and if you have been along the journey of this channel for some time, you know that I used to have a show that I did once a week called While You're Reforging, which was essentially just kind of collating all the things that are happening in the gaming community, specifically, obviously, for Games Workshop products, and putting them into a show that really, the design of the idea was just to give you something to listen to while you paint, meaning while you are reforging, while you're building your army or rebuilding it after a catastrophic battle. Well, life has kind of gone sideways the last couple months, and honestly, year and a half. So instead of doing that, where it's very difficult for me to kind of collate what's happened in a given week because of recording times and things like that, I decided I'm going to relaunch the show, but in this time, we're going to keep the core idea of giving you something to paint to, but with a little bit different in terms of content ideas. These are ancient White Dwarf magazines. I have a massive stack of them. I kind of kept collecting them because a local store was selling them for $1 each, and I was like, there's a little bit of content in there I could totally mine. Some cool stories from the old world, certainly some cool design ideas from when Games Workshop had, shall we say, the cocaine-induced 80s, just wild ideas for game systems. For example, in this, if not this one, there's another one next to it, but basically you can build your own vehicles for 40K, because that used to be a thing. And so what I'm going to be doing is just going through these magazines and talking about them, reading stories, reading fiction, and again, still while reforging, because the point of the show is just to give you something to listen to while you paint. So I'm going to go over to the downward cam, and we're going to be checking out White Dwarf issue, 251 from December. Interesting, it actually has a 25-year celebration for Games Workshop logo on there. So I'm going to abbreviate some of the contents of this because there are some things I definitely want to talk about, and then some things that I think are just kind of interesting, but I don't have like a whole lot to say on them. For example, if you're relatively new to Age of Sigmar, and by that I mean, Games Workshop stuff the last few years, they used to do these global campaigns, and this one was the Third War for Armageddon, where people in stores and stuff could send in game results and they would tally it all. And it was a really interesting thing because it was right at the dawn of the internet era, when people chat rooms and that kind of thing were existing, but they didn't have the capabilities of, say, real-time campaign management that other softwares now allow us to do. Instead, you would take photos and send in pictures. Here's obviously a giant warlord titan, which is, I think, pretty well to scale, seeing as how it's about the size of a small child. And there's some cool stuff like that. Now, what was interesting is the more I learn about these old campaigns, the more there seems to have been a trend in the past of the Imperium players, meaning Space Marines, Astra Militarum, all the good guys, right? Quote unquote. Of the good guys being like, man, we got this in the bag. We have more than half the armies in the game. We can absolutely nail this as long as we just everybody plays their best. And then every other faction, so like Chaos Space Marine specifically, was like, listen up, nerds. We need to get our crap together because there's no way we're going to lose to these guys. And one group just naturally became more coordinated because they understood the odds were against them. It was a very interesting thing to see. But essentially, depending on where you played and where you submitted results, they would collate it into, like, for example, this section is 4 panels representing different parts of the planet of Armageddon. But you see here it says Spain. All the results from Spain are collated, and you can see they have different locations. The Vulcan Bridge, the, Orc Rock drop sites. And basically they're splitting up how the contestants did. So, for example, the outcome, Imperial held, contested, Imperial held, that kind of stuff. And so you get a sense with these little bars here on the bottom exactly what's going on, and it seems in this particular issue the Imperium is winning everywhere except for the plains of Arthron, which is their data is collated from Africa, which is kind of cool. Anyway, it's also in places like this where we got some interesting side rules. For example, we have Brother Captain Tycho at Tempestora Hive, meaning Tycho is a character that exists within the Blood Angels, but this is him in that specific battle. So they gave you a unique, what we would know as war scroll or data entry, or data sheet rather, and then put him in there. And I like this kind of stuff, even though it doesn't last forever. There's a shelf life to how long the rules last. It's still cool to see. And of course, there's all the different continents and countries. It's not just continents. Africa is its own thing, but like Germany, United Kingdom, that kind of stuff. Here we have Warlord Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, Commissar Yarrick from back in the day. And again, I'm just going to kind of breeze through these because it's just recapping planets, but I just wanted to show off that quite a bit. And so then they have a wrap up of what's gone on with the Armageddon rules. So we're going to keep on moving. Another thing I wanted to touch on from the annals of Warhammer history is this idea of the regiments of renown. Now, we sort of had this with mercenaries for like one very brief season in Age of Sigmar, but essentially Games Workshop used to take some of their existing model kits and then give them alternate rules so they can be used in a variety of armies. And I'll give you an example here. This is one that I really like. So, Bjorg Bearstruck and the Bearmen of Urslo. For hire. Bjorg and his Bearmen can be hired as a special unit in Dogs of War armies. Alternatively, they can be hired as a rare unit in other armies except Bretonnia, High Elves, Wood Elves, and Lizard Men. So they give you a sense of like, there used to be a separate army type known as Dogs of War. We're going to ignore that for right now. But any army could hire the Bearmen of Urslo, and it would just take up a slot in their army, a rare unit, which I'm not going to go into too much. Force organizations used to be super different in Fantasy Battles than they are in AOS. But essentially, you get Bjorg, which is the named character who's leading this group. Orl, meaning, let's see here, points. Bjorg and the 9 Bearmen, including Orl the Young, the Banner Bearer, and a Hornblower, cost a total of 255 points. This is the minimum size of the unit you can hire. The regiment may be enlarged by adding extra models at the cost of 8 points each. Unit size is 10 or more. And basically the reason I'm pointing all this out is it would give you a cool way. This is the Savage Bearmen of Urslo. This is an old Chaos Marauder unit, and you could put it into any army. And I love that kind of stuff. Again, give me more of this. This is all I want. Give me a reason to go buy a random box of Marauders, for example. There's better model kits now, but I love this stuff. I feel like in some aspects, and I would love to hear your comments down below about this, Age of Sigmar has become like, there's enough of a competitive focus within the game to not be welcoming to things like this anymore. I'm not saying that like competitive players are killing fun. Not at all. It's just a different kind of fun. The game is great right now, but I do think we lose something when we move away from the basics of give me a reason to buy a model kit that I wouldn't normally buy and just have some fun. Right? Like, it's 10 or more guys. If you buy a box of Marauders today, it's 20 dudes in the box. It's the full unit of the Savage Bearmen of Urslo, and you can just have a fun little modeling project that you can inject into any army. Now, across the ideas, let me just shoot some ideas out here for you so you can get excited too. We have Dark Elf Assassins, Giants of Albion. Let's see. They count as 2 rare units. And let's see. Wounds. Yeah, they got a couple of wounds on them. They're not really actual giant. No, they are. They're huge. Okay. But you have giants you can hire. You have a Lost Legion of basically human fighters, free guild. A Republican Guard. Again, you can create backstories for all these things. The Bearmen of Urslo. Marksmen. Let's see. Volan's Venators. I'm not familiar with that one. Al Mukhtar's Desert Dogs. This is sort of the desert Sahara themed version of cavalry that they used to have. The Alcanti Fellowship. So anyway, the ones I want to point out here is Lumpen Krups Fightin' Cocks. Lumpen Krups Fightin' Cocks can be hired as a special unit in Dogs of War army. Could also be hired as rare. And essentially, it's a bunch of halflings trying to herd fighting chickens at the enemy. It's amazing. You could hire a Dragon Lord, some pirates. Like, you know, it's just all these kinds of things where you could have all kinds of weird stuff. There's Leopold's Leopard Company, which is like, what the heck is going on? Goldfang's Ogres, the Birdmen of Katraza. If you have not seen that, they are essentially, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, these are the goblins who launch themselves out of like catapults and stuff like that. They have the little wings that they can fly at the enemy with. I don't know. So I just wanted to point that out. I think that's an incredibly fun idea. And man, at the end of the day, if you're a model company, it seems real good that you would have reasons for me to go out and buy models. I'm going to do a spotlight on this guy, Luther Huss, the Prophet of Sigmar. I really actually do like him quite a bit. He also featured, I believe in this, the Battle of Meinhof, if I'm not mistaken. Let's just double check here. I'm looking for anything that says Luther. Maybe not. And then I believe this was the issue where they began to introduce the Giants kit, like one of the old, ugliest sin giant kits that I cannot stand. But to see how much their rules have evolved, honestly not, I mean, like the same core is there. You have a really big beefy stat line, and then he can have special abilities that are all randomized, whether he's stuffing people into a bag, eating them. He can yell and brawl, jump, swing, all these kinds of things. Like, there's just a lot of randomness involved with giants, but they're also a large liability because you can't really control what they're gonna do. So while you are painting, Let's read about Luther Huss. I think that sounds like a lot of fun. All this lore is like super hard to find now, so I don't care about reading it. In the early days of Karl Franz's reign, a boy appeared at the gate of a Sigmarite monastery near Weissenberg and pleaded to be allowed to join the ranks of the warrior monks. When asked about his past, the boy did not answer. All he would say is that his name was Luther Huss, though his burning desire to fight chaos was soon clear to all. Many years of hard training, intense study, and inflexible discipline followed. The lean boy grew up to become a tall, muscular young man whose fighting skills were soon a match for his instructors. He also proved an eager student of the way of Sigmar, and, at the completion of his studies, he could engage his old teachers in subtle dialectic duels. One thing remained for Luther to earn a place amongst his brothers. He needed to face darkness in battle and defeat it. Luther left the monastery and walked across the empire, preaching faith in Sigmar and looking for a sign, a chance to prove his worth against chaos. He finally had his chance in Weismund, or Weismund, I believe it's how it's pronounced, a small town at the edge of the Drakewald forest. When Luther reached Weismund, he found a great commotion among the population. Squads of the town's militia were in full alarm. Peasants and woodsmen were flooding to the relative safety of the town's palisades with their livestock. It looked as though they were preparing for a siege. Luther soon found out that a large band of beastmen had attacked the area, and many isolated communities had already been destroyed. Painful memories of his childhood, remember he wouldn't talk about it, flickered through the novice's mind. He was soon busy striding around the town, inspiring the defenders with fiery speeches and helping them get ready for the imminent attack. Help had been sent for, but the nearest garrison of regular troops was in Helmgart, and reinforcements would take days to reach Weismund. Suddenly, the foul children of chaos were upon the town. Great were the feats of valor that Luther accomplished. The power of Sigmar was strong with him that day. His mighty warhammer struck down many abominations, and the supernatural aura protected him during the fight. The blows of the enemies were unable to pierce his armor, and the evil sorcery of the shaman who was leading the beastmen was totally powerless against Luther. Even a huge bull-headed horror succumbed to the implacable priest. After 2 days of uninterrupted fighting, an imperial relief force reached the town and the beastmen fled back to the forest. Luther joined the troops in the pursuit, but when the soldiers reached the edge of the woods, they stopped, judging it folly to continue under the dark canopy of the trees. Luther was undeterred and followed the fleeing creatures of chaos, determined to wipe them all out. The soldiers set up camp close by in case the beastmen decided to return. Soon everybody was convinced that the ferocious novice had surely been killed, but after 3 days Luther emerged once more from the forest, his armor in tatters, his exhausted body covered in blood of his enemies. Luther reached the camp, dragging behind him the massive horned head of the shaman. After this victory against chaos, Luther returned to the monastery where he was ordained, and from that day on, he joined his brothers on the battlefield where he distinguished himself fighting the minions of darkness. Luther quickly rose through the ranks and eventually was chosen to join the delegation representing his order at the Sigmarite Council in Altdorf. The reason for this council was the election of a new arch-lector to replace Manfred of Nuln, who had disappeared in the north during his crusade against the Chaos warlord Archaon. Luther was deeply troubled by what he witnessed in the council. He saw fat clergy more concerned with politics and business than in pursuing the holy mission bestowed upon them by Sigmar, the fight against chaos. The grand theologianist Volkmar was absent from the council. The old man was spending more and more time in the high pinnacle at the top of the temple of Sigmar. For days at a time, he would lock himself in the secret repository of the tomes and forbidden lore in search of an answer to the dark menace gathering in the far north. Malign rumors circulated in the council, and even some doubted Volkmar's sanity because of the many hours he spent reading those unholy grimoires. Without the theogenist guidance, the influence of the archlectors was growing. They were steering the position of the clergy of Sigmar towards the achievement of their selfish political aims. With all the fervor of his burning faith, Luther openly denounced the spiritual relaxation, attacking the lectors in the council with hard words of reproach. To fight chaos on the battlefields, not to grow rich and fat in the golden halls of the capital. That is the purpose of our cult, boomed Luther. Needless to say, that did not win him much popularity with the arch-lectors, and he was ordered to apologize by his superiors in the order. The young and pious Luther could not obey that order, which was an open contradiction with everything he had always believed in. He finally decided to resign his position and leave the assembly. From that day on, Luther has traveled throughout the empire, preaching against the corruption of the heads of the cult of Sigmar and inciting the faithful to seek the will of Sigmar without mediation of the clergy. Luther has become a nightmare of every corrupt priest, and the rumors are the worst of them have met a grisly end at his hand. The arch-lectors have asked the theologians to excommunicate Luther, but the holy man has never agreed with them. Indeed, Luther has never attacked Volkmar in his speeches. The enigmatic smile that appears on the theologian's face when Luther is mentioned to him has led many to think that the old man knows something important about Luther, something he cannot or does not want to reveal. Luther Huss appears most often whenever the forces of the Empire are facing evil and unholy enemies. Beastmen scaving the living dead, and all are blasphemous against Sigmar and must be smitten by the faithful. Luther fights beside the soldiers of the Empire. His example and inspiring words are a great aid to those unholy foes. His powers stronger... Sorry, my mic's in the way here. And inspiring words are a great aid to those fighting against unholy foes, his power stronger than those of any other priest of Sigmar. Now, I had heard the name Luther Huss before, but I didn't actually have a lot of story for him. I remember him, I think he was mentioned in the End Times campaign, which, if you know my personal story, like, I got into the game right when the End Times was going on, and so, there's a lot of name salad in that. They throw out a lot of people, but I didn't have a lot of context for them. But the idea of this guy just sounds awesome. Now, how they took this character that is, a larger than life zealot, so to speak, and brought it into rules, just to put it very simply without going into too much detail about fantasy battle rules, they gave you a character of a priest on a horse. Okay, and you could not modify that in any way whatsoever. It actually says here, you can't change him. But he does get a pretty cool weapon. He's got a two-handed hammer. It's a great weapon, which he's not going to hit all the time, but when he does, it's going to be nasty. In addition to that, he is the chosen of Sigmar, so he himself has a ward save, which is actually a term that was in fantasy battles, went out of vogue for AOS, and then has since come back. So we're talking about the same thing, even though a lot of years have passed. He helps you unbind spells. So this one says he adds an additional die to the spell pool. The way they kind of translate that into Age of Sigmar speak would be something like when he is targeted by a spell, roll a die on a 6-up, the spell has no effect. That kind of thing. Not necessarily on a 6, but you get the idea. He has a way of shutting down magic with his holy blessings of Sigmar. Righteous Fury, he essentially can inspire troops who would normally be immune to psychology to greater acts of zealotry and destruction. So it's basically like, hey, even if he joins a unit or is near a unit that doesn't normally care about psychology stuff, he can inspire them and they fight harder. Also, because of that, there's only certain units he can join. He could still be fielded and just run around by himself. Terrible idea, but he can do it. And also, he is a priest, but to put it in Age of Sigmar terms, it's like he gets +1 to all of his prayer rolls. So, yes, please give me this character. This immediately makes me think of the Devoted of Sigmar, which is a sub-faction that I used to really like before they cut out the big, the eagle and the shrine that they used to have. It used to just be like they had this big shrine and it would exude an aura, and it was very similar to the way that the Great Bell operates for the Clan Rats or the War Shrine for Chaos stuff. You used to have a big centerpiece model that gives a series of buffs to horde units around it, and I really liked that. But they've gotten rid of that kit, and as I look at the Devoted of Sigmar, it's like what they need is characters like this, right? A bunch of stupid chumps in all of the flagellants rushing forward. I liked having the big centerpiece that delivers buffs. I think they could do a much more Age of Sigmar religious themed version of it. Hopefully they do. But these kind of characters are going to be the ones that lead that kind of faction, right? Where it's battle monks, where yeah, the flagellants have the faith, but they don't have the discipline, right? I mean, the discipline is like when you learn how to fight or learn how to, move in heavy armor or, obviously reciting scripture and those kinds of things. Like, he is a full-time priest, community organizer, and warrior. Boom, all in one. And honestly, this is the way that I like stuff coming out. I feel like with our newer versions of White Dwarf magazine, we see a lot less of this. And actually, I did a video a long time ago talking about the origins of vampires in the Fantasy Battle universe, and I used a magazine like this. And I got a lot of corrections in that video about like, no, actually, this is what it said in a different Black Library book and that kind of stuff. What's happening is this is the inspiration. This little thing is everything there is about Luther Huss. And then writers will go in and flush it out. Like I haven't read any books about Luther Huss. If there is one, please let me know in the comments down below. Haven't read a single one, but this is my thesis statement to get me hooked, right? Like I want to know more about this guy. I want to know about his past and how there's all kinds of dark shades that he might be carrying that other characters might not know. And then a Black Library author can turn it into a novel. But this kind of thing, I feel like doesn't show up enough in White Dwarf magazines anymore. A snippet, and then, here's a basic model. Here's how you can kit bash him to make him look like whatever. And then boom, Luther Huss is there. How cool would that be to have? If they really wanted to, they could even have each annual, not Tome of Champions, the General's Handbook list off, hey, from issue 452 of White Dwarf, this War Scroll, Luther Huss, is legal within the context of this battle pack. Like, I like that idea. That would be so stinking fun. And yes, it means that there's a time limit on things, but it allows me to create a cool narrative for these characters, and maybe after that time, he just kind of goes back to being a priest on a mount, right? I mean, whatever that equivalent is. So let's say hypothetically, I'm going to go back in time a little bit before we had a model for him, but let's say Guard of Steel Soul. If this article was about Guard of Steel Soul and you had a little, War Scroll entry for him and 2 pages of lore, that would get me excited enough to paint him up, to have a little force, and when that season's over, he just goes back to being a Lord Celestin, and I'm fine with that. Now, moving along, we got some cool stories. We have a story here of, what does this look like? Goblins attacking, so let's go ahead and read this one now. This is The Battle of Meinhof by Pete Grady. The Orc army was on the move. The greenskin horde approached the Castle Meinhof from the west, silhouetted against the blood-red setting sun. Albrecht, one of the crossbowmen stationed on the battlements, blinked and then stared. He could have sworn he saw something. There! The damn greenskins were pushing some kind of war engine along with them. He squinted against the setting sun, but could only discern a large swaying blot against the light. Probably a siege tower, he thought, and shouted warnings to the defenders below. Siege weapons were hoisted up to the battlements, and bowmen in their hundreds lined up against the walls, already sizing up their targets. As the army closed, Albrecht thought he could hear a massive bellowing. He had heard the orcs' terrible war cry before, but this was far worse than he remembered. The sun was now setting, and the army was close enough for Albrecht to use his spyglass without blinding himself to the sun's rays. There was something about the siege engine that troubled him. That bellowing didn't sound like many voices, but just one. As Albrecht focused on the shape, he let out an involuntary cry of terror, the spyglass falling from his hand. Luther, his sergeant, rushed up to him. Well, that's kind of an unfortunate naming, seeing how the previous story was Luther Huss, but I don't think that's actually him. Luther, his sergeant, rushed up to him to see what was the matter, followed by a handful of the crossbowmen. They each looked through the spyglass in turn, every man muttering a curse or a short prayer. The thing was no engine, but a living creature the size of a castle wall. It walked like a man, but each step covered 100 paces. It wielded a huge tree trunk the way a man might hold a club. Carrion crows had gathered around its head, and it swatted at them like a man swats flies. A giant marched with the orc army. The greenskins ground to a halt. Boar boys fought to keep their mounts from charging. Within the goblin mobs, remember this is back in the day when orcs and goblins were part of one army. Within the goblin mobs, masses of small, evil creatures pushed and shoved with each other maliciously. Orc bosses yelled and threatened their regiments to stand fast. Catapults and bolt throwers were dragged into position. Slowly and clumsily, the orcs formed into a rough battle line. It was the largest orc army that had ever been seen in Talabim, and those inside the castle readied their weapons with a haste born of fear. Now that the orcs were close enough to be seen individually, the size of the giant was all the more terrifying. It strode through the ranks as a man would walk through tall grass, towering over the rock labas and trolls. In the distance, the defenders could see the fearful orc warlord raise his crooked sword to the sky. At his signal, the entire army fell quiet, all bar two mobs of goblins who had taken a sudden dislike to one another. What began as an argument degenerated rapidly into a brawl. As a veteran of many battles, Albrecht could not fathom this lack of discipline, watching as orc bosses stalked over to the goblins, beating them back into submission. A hush fell over the attackers. The orcs managed to regain control over their charges to silence the horde for a moment. In the quiet, a few goblins could still be heard jeering or making foul oaths. Both armies watched each other, muscles tensed for the coming attack. Then, as if with some hidden signal, the orc warcry roared from 1,000 savage throats. The goblins joined in with their reedy nasal howl, and even the trolls bellowed. Then the creature joined in. Its one voice almost drowned out the entire army. No sooner had the shout ended than the entire orc horde charged, a horrific green tide surging towards the castle walls with a giant in their midst. Immediately, scores of fingers released bowstrings and the sky darkened. Arrows fell like deadly rain into the charging greenskins. Dozens of orcs stumbled in their charge, finally falling to the ground, holding the arrows that had slain them. Hundreds of goblins died in the advance, so tightly packed in their mobs that a single arrow skewered multiple targets. Unseen to the attackers, outriders and hunters made their way out of the castle in an attempt to outflank the enemy. Meanwhile, catapults began delivering their deadly cargo into the center of the orc army. In answer, orc spear chukkas and rock labbas began pounding the castle walls. Time-worn masonry crumbled under the savage assault, but the walls held, and the heavily fortified defenders were spared from the worst of the orc firepower. In spite of the carnage all around it, the giant kept coming. The defenders could see a score of arrows sticking out of his skin like pine needles, but it hadn't broken its pace once. Cannon crews worked frantically to aim their weapons at the moving target. Albrecht swallowed his fear and leveled his crossbow at the approaching nightmare, yelling at his men to do the same. There was a dull, pulpy thud as a crossbow bolt impacted with the giant's right eye, burying itself so deep in the wound it almost disappeared. Despite the horror of the battle, Albrecht let out a shout of victory. Surely it must fall now. The creature swayed in its advance, and the defenders took heart. Maybe the creature would fall. The orcs seemed to think so too, as the entire army parted around it, each greenskin trying to gauge where the giant might fall, anxious not to be crushed under its monstrous bulk. But it was only a hesitation. Thrown off balance for a moment, the giant managed to regain its momentum and completed its charge. There was a sound like thunder. Rock droppers and cauldrons of boiling oil toppled back off the battlements. Huge stones showered from the walls onto the defenders, crushing them where they stood. The giant had run headlong into the wall. Scrambling to his feet, Albrecht glanced over the wall itself. A huge indentation had formed in the castle, but the ancient stone, though forced inward, had not yielded. The giant pulled itself out of the wall, masonry falling from its body. The massive impact didn't seem to bother it, neither did the continuing streams of arrows piercing its flesh. The outriders had finally gotten into position and the charge to the rear of the monster, discharging a concentrated volley of pistol fire at its legs. The giant turned and clumsily reached down. Albrecht watched in disbelief as one of the cavalrymen and his mount was picked up and thrown into his comrades with terrifying force. Then another thunderclap. The defenders feared the worst. Had another giant somehow joined the attack? All eyes turned in the direction of the sound, and saw the giant topple like a felled tree. A cheer went up from the defenders as they realized one of their cannon crews had finally scored a hit on the monster. Then, to the horror of all, the giant slowly pulled itself upright. It shook its head like a dazed man, the cannonball still lodged in its enormous chest. With the uncharacteristic speed, one of the cannon crew was plucked off the battlement. His fellows watched helplessly as the screaming man was fed into the fetid maw of the foul monster. When it had finished eating, the giant slowly and carefully began pacing away through the orc army, looking back angrily at the unyielding wall. When it was almost behind the orcs' stone throwers, it suddenly turned and broke into a run, bounding clumsily back towards the battle. It hit the castle like a monstrous battering ram, people inside were thrown off their feet. The ancient walls could stand no more, and a gaping rent formed as the giant fell through the breach. Complete panic broke out. Veterans of a dozen campaigns fell back. Swordsmen fled in terror. The horror was now inside the walls, and as it got up, hundreds of orcs poured between its legs. Last line here, Castle Meinhof was doomed. This is our introduction rules-wise to the giants, which is, I love the fact that up here it says huge, and this guy was like maybe this tall, like 3.5 inches. I mean, it was not that short, but you know what I mean? It was ridiculously short compared to a mega gargant, which actually, you know, as I'm reading this, and tell me if you agree, given the relative size of the miniature of this old giant model to a standard, let's say, goblin, I feel like this description, this story introduction works so well for mega gargants, just given their sheer size and scale, more so than gargants, like the typical giants we've had for the longest time, which was an updated version of this model. I like it quite a bit. I don't know where Meinhof was. It sounds like a minor location, seeing as how it was, you know, introduced and annihilated in a single 2-page long story. But that sounds super rad. It makes me honestly want to like copy paste this into the Mega Gargants or the Sons of Behemoth book, because you know, there's not a lot of good depictions, and mostly it's because of the length of the stories. When you read, say, the Battle of Meinhof in an Age of Sigmar battle tome would be about a paragraph long and part of their, like, you know, timeline stories. But this is something, because they have more space, I feel like this is a more interesting picture of what a Mega Gargant could be. And I'm just going to call him a Mega Gargant because it was the biggest, you know, at the time, the giant was the biggest model that they had in terms of, like, the scale of the universe, whatever. But now, I think we can all agree, this sounds like a Mega Gargant. Like, something that is so large it can run straight headlong into an established stone wall the first time it bounces off, and then it does a second charge and comes right at it. I like the wacky ability to absorb damage has never changed in Warhammer. Like, if I crack open my Sons of Behemoth battle tome right now, there's stories about them having random arrows sticking out of places, and like, oh, there's a harpoon in his toe and he uses that to like pull seaweed out of the ground. They're just ridiculous things. This guy's been shot with a bunch of arrows, pistol shot, he has a cannonball in his chest, he has an arrow in his eye, like by the end of the story, and he still won. Like, nobody looks good when they walk away all beat to hell. They also took the time to mention that every army was terrified of where this guy was going to fall, if he was going to fall. And that's because giants, from their inception, have had this idea of falling over. And so, let's see here. Fall over. Giants are ungainly and frequently befuddled, as a consequence of which they are often trip, stumble, or fall down. They are especially prone to this if they've ever been raiding the local brewery. When a giant falls over, this is bad news for everyone nearby, as a falling giant can easily squash anything it falls on. A giant must test to see whether it falls over if any of the following apply. When it is beaten in close combat, they used to have combat tests that were a little bit different than anything we do now. If at the start of the movement phase it's fleeing, and when it crosses an obstacle. And the last one here is the giant decided to jump up and down on an enemy. So you have the ability to do different kinds of attacks. One of them is jump up and down, so the idea is that you might lose your footing as you're stomping on something. I like this quite a bit because nowadays we just have standard attack profiles. You know, the big swinging fists are going to do this attack profile. His stomping feet will do this. They've actually added quite a few special attacks, which I think makes them more fun. Giants do not attack in the same way as other creatures, though they select their victims as normal. They're far too large and fractious to take orders, and much too scatterbrained to have any sort of coherent plan. In fact, once in combat, even the giant doesn't really know how it's going to do. To determine what happens, each close combat phase, roll a d6 on one of the following tables when it's the giant's turn to fight. Which table you use depends on the size of the giant's victim. When fighting characters riding monsters, decide whether to attack the rider or the mount as normal and use the appropriate table for the size of the target. That's an interesting concept. So again, in fantasy battles, you could separate the rider and the mount when their attacks were. I hated this because at the time when I was starting to learn how to play, I loved having high elves on dragons that were all fire themed. I even did a cool kit bash of that. But people would just, 3 cannons takes out any dragon in the game. So I just have this dumpy looking hero elf model on the table who's like, well, I came here with a dragon, but I seem to have lost my car. That's exactly how it felt every single game. They would just ice the dragon. Let's see, giants fighting big things ogres, kroxigors, minotaurs, or similarly sized or larger creatures, including chariots. So I like that there's a bit of vagueness there. They leave that open for you and your opponent to determine what is the size of this thing. But anything basically bigger than a standard infantry model. You could yell and brawl, thump it with a club, or headbutt. That was your essentially a D. It's not really a D3. On a 1, it's yell and brawl. 2 through 4, thump with a club, and 5 and 6, headbutt. Interesting. So what's thump with a club? I'm just going to pick one of these and we'll go through it. Thump with a club. Most giants carry a big club, often a tree trunk or a big bone. If they have no weapons, they will use their enormous fist. The giant picks one model as their target and brings down his clubs with a single mighty stroke. The target may attempt to avoid the blow by taking and passing an initiative test. Use the lowest if the model has several different values. Using the lowest instead of the highest is a huge deal. If avoided, there is no effect. If failed, the target is struck and takes 2d6 wounds. Here's the thing. 2d6 wounds was massive back in fantasy battles. Like, truly huge. In a world of most everybody having such few, if you consider the fact that this guy himself has 6 wounds, think about that, that's huge. With no armor saves allowed. If a double is rolled, the giant's club embeds itself in the ground and the giant cannot attack at all in the following round whilst he recovers his weapon. Now this is where we have a bit of debate, okay? There's a difference between simulation and gameplay. I like this set of rules as a simulation. That is, your giant swings, he hits the ground, and now, oh man, his weapon's stuck, now he has to pry it out. From a game perspective, that neutralizes a lot of the value of this opponent. He could fall over, which means you could hurt your own guys. Sometimes his weapon's going to get stuck in the ground and he's not going to do a dang thing. All of these attacks have some kind of caveat that is sort of like and if things go really bad, you're not going to like it, which is not good if you're trying to build a competitive list and you want to have a balanced game system and all kind of stuff. It's phenomenal if you want to tell a story about a Mega Gargant who tries his best to attack everything and is just a dumpy turd who keeps tripping and falling and his weapons get stuck. Like, it's a very... If you were sitting there with a journal and writing out what happened this round, it could be a very fun story about these ridiculous things happening. And that's what I'm here for. So this is our introduction to the giants. Giants and greenskins have a long history of association, and it's common to find that greenskin hordes include a giant brought along to add weight and height to the army's combat prowess. It's not altogether clear why greenies and giants should get on so well, but it is noticeable that giants are one of the few races who are considerably bigger and dimmer than even the biggest, thickest orc. I like it a lot. Now, friends, I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode of While You're Reforging. We looked at some cool history for the Empire as well as the introduction of giants. I don't think this is the first giant model. I'm very certain it's not, but it's a great way to introduce them with a cool story that really, I think, I like these kinds of stories because this gives you all of the reasoning for some of the dumber rules that exist on the actual unit entry. And I don't feel like we always get that with various Warhammer things. Like, whenever a unit has like a caveat or a downside or a potential risk reward type mechanic, a lot of times it's given like maybe a sentence of flavor text, whereas in this little story in however many paragraphs has outlined for us, one, they're terrifying, they're massive, they're siege weapons that are alive, they can take damage like crazy, they have the potential to fall over, and everyone is scared about when they fall over. They're hard to put down, they're great on the charge. Like, it gives you a narrative thing that as you're reading the actual rule portions, they are hearkening back to the story you just read. And that's the kind of stuff that I like Warhammer for, where it's like story meets rules, story meets rules. And yes, you're going to take this unit and it's going to disappoint you utterly. It's going to trip and fall on your own guys. It's probably just going to die real easy by 2 cannon shots to the forehead, although I would argue that that's 2 cannon shots that weren't going into anything else. His weapon might get stuck. It doesn't matter, but after the game is done, you and your opponent are going to step back and be like, what a doofus. It's just a fun story. It just adds to the overall tally of stories that you have and memorable moments of good laughs to be had. Now, I'm going to continue with this one because this particular White Dwarf, like I said, it is 251, and there's the cover in case you want to see it. I know for some reason when I look online, the numbers are like 1 off from each other with the UK and the US. Not quite sure why, but we're going to continue, and in our next While You're Reforging, we're going to take a look at the fall of Karak 8 Peaks, and then review a battle report that they have in here, which I love these old school battle report guys, talking about the various factions and things. I actually had an idea of collecting an Old Hammer army just specifically to recreate one of these things. I haven't decided what I want to do, but that's exactly what I'm looking for. And this is also, you can tell, a big year for Orcs and Goblins because they had a big painting contest surrounding them. But yeah, we're going to take a look at the fall of Karak 8 Peaks, the battle report, and there was one more article on Balthazar Gelt, who I am very excited to learn about because this is a character, fun fact, that made his way into Age of Sigmar, but we will conquer that little juicy tidbit later on. So friends, thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoy this. Hope you got some painting done, and that you'll join me next time. Thank you so much. Happy wargaming, and I hope you enjoyed your Reforging.